Hello.
Sorry about that.
Sorry. Hello. They need to check the sound of my voice. How is it? Is it better now? Keep talking about things that are important to talk about. And you want me to keep talking? You really need me to just, yeah, he has to keep checking the sound level. So I just have to keep talking. But luckily I work with such like wonderful, thoughtful colleagues that you can all laughing at me as I sit here awkwardly. Oh, stop.
Hello, hello, testing. Hello, my name is Tunchai. Yeah, great.
It's after 1, right? Okay, yeah. You gonna count me in? He pops off his stuff. Paramedics are learning in class right now, right? And after I introduce you, I will kind of step away so you have the space. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us this afternoon in the Ishkudoan courtyard here at the Ottawa campus on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So hello, Perth, Pembroke, and anyone who's joining us online. My name's Sarah Gaughan, and I have the pleasure of opening today's learning session with Tunchai Redvers. So we're so pleased to have you here today to talk about decolonizing gender. So I'm going to do the formal part and read your bio, so then we can turn it over to you and you can share some learning with us. So Tunchai Redvers is a Dene Métis two-spirit social justice warrior, writer, creator, facilitator, and multidisciplinary performer actor belonging to the Denonokwe First Nation in Treaty 8 territory. With a BA in International Development Studies, certificate in civic engagement and global citizenship, and a master's of Indigenous social work. They've been nationally and internationally recognized for their work in advocacy, featured in the likes of the Toronto Star, BuzzFeed, the Globe and Mail, eTalk, TEDx, and more than 100 other talks. Tunchai has delivered across Canada, the US, and Australia. They're also a touring drag king and performance artist with performances spanning stages such as Pride Toronto and the Fierce Queer International Burlesque Festival. With a passion for exploring and unpacking topics such as intergenerational trauma, nonprofit work, gender and sexuality, youth and queer empowerment, and positive representation, their approach is one that aims to decolonize and indigenize identity, mental health, and healing. So we are so happy to welcome you this afternoon.
Awesome. Masicho, Sarah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I've been looking forward to this talk and this beautiful space for months now, and just really grateful to be here. Happy Pride, happy Indigenous Peoples Month. My friends and I joke around that, you know, we get to walk. Oh, there we go. We get to walk around all June and say, get out of my way, I'm queer and Indigenous, I'm coming. And that's definitely how I feel, not just this month, but every single month, every single day of my existence. So once again, Masicho for having me, if you're here in person or online watching. Iflanatea, Tsitsi Tunchai Suye. How are you? My given name is Tunchai Redvers. as Sarah mentioned, I am Dene and Métis, and I belong to Deninoquay First Nation in what is known as the Northwest Territories, Treaty 8 territory. I was born and raised in the North, but I currently live in Decolonizing, otherwise known as Toronto or Dish with One Spoon territory, where I've been living for some number of years now. In my Dene culture, it's always really important to introduce who you are, the place that you take up in this world, because we all carry our own perspectives, experiences, everything that has brought us here to this moment. And so everything that I share comes from this experience that I've had in this lifetime. As mentioned, I'm a writer, a creator, a multidisciplinary performer, a bit of a nomad. I am a drag king and burlesque performer. I have a background in international and community development, and I carry a master's of Indigenous social work. I have spent the better part of 8 years working directly with Indigenous young people and communities. I am the co-founder of We Matter, a national Indigenous youth-led organization dedicated to Indigenous youth hope and life promotion. One sec, technical difficulties. The realities of being outside, folks. The co-founder of We Matter, a national Indigenous youth-led organization dedicated to Indigenous youth hope and life promotion. I love working with Indigenous young people, queer, two-spirit, trans, Indigenous young people. I have been able to travel coast to coast, meeting with a plethora and diversity of Indigenous communities, both nationally and internationally. And all of this informs what I'm here to talk to you about today, which is exactly that, decolonizing our understanding of gender and sexuality, and the role of performance art in my own journey of understanding gender and sexuality. And so with that, I want to share a little bit more of my story. Growing up as an Indigenous young person in the North, when I turned on the TV, when I read magazines, when I read books, when I watched movies, when I engaged with content and media, I never saw myself represented. I never saw people who looked like me, were from the same communities as me. I felt like who had the same experience as me, the same histories as me. I never saw myself represented in the world around me. And when I did see myself represented in the world around me, it was usually from a place of trauma and shame. It was constant nameless headlines about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, about substance use and addiction and violence. And on top of what I was exposed to, I also experienced and saw a lot of these exact challenges in the communities and families that I grew up in around. Those issues of substance abuse, of addiction, of racism, of violence, of lateral violence, mental illness, intergenerational trauma. These were all things that made up the world that I grew up occupying. And it was really tough growing up as an Indigenous young person because I lacked the support and resources to understand why all of this was happening, to understand why I was walking and experiencing in this world that I was. So I struggled myself. I struggled with mental health, with anxiety, with depression, and even suicidal ideation. There were times in my life where I felt like I maybe shouldn't be here. And in addition to being an Indigenous young person, I also was a closeted Indigenous young person. I mentioned I grew up in the North. The town I'm from has 3,600 people. Quite small, quite remote, quite northern. And so in addition to a lack of Indigenous visibility and representation, or poor Indigenous representation and visibility, there was absolutely no queer representation or visibility. And this wasn't that long ago. But growing up, I didn't even know queer identities existed. I hadn't heard of this term queer. All I knew was that homophobia and transphobia was so rampant and ingrained in the communities and family and friend groups that I existed in. The only time I heard about being queer or gay had to do with slurs. I know "that's gay" is a common phrase that's used as something that's like bad or not good or stupid. And so I grew up hearing and seeing all of this problematic media about what it meant to be queer. Gender diverse wasn't even a thing in high school. And so it took a long time for me to come into my identity. And I say come into my identity rather than come out, because for me, it was a coming in, it was a returning to my authentic self. But that journey to acceptance wasn't always easy. It was fraught with shame and denial and suppression. In fact, I didn't want to stay in the North. I wanted to get as far away as possible. I felt like there was this whole other world that I needed to experience, and I didn't necessarily feel safe to grow as a person in my identities. And so at the age of 18, I picked up and I left the North and I moved to Ontario, where I remain to this day. And I still maintain strong connections to home and home territory. But my journey of identity has since evolved. I went through periods of deep shame, of not wanting to accept who I am, and also a fear of what it meant if I did out myself, if I did begin to identify as other, as queer. And so when I did come out or come in, it didn't necessarily get easier in all regards. I was welcomed with so much acceptance from certain friends and family. But there were also family members who weren't accepting of me when I came out. Family members whose shame became my shame. And so there was also a disconnection to family when I decided to be my authentic self. And there was this period in time after I had come out, and I was really, I really wanted to be a representation of something I had never seen. I wanted to be proud of being Dene, of being queer. I wanted to be proud, and I wanted other Indigenous queer young people to see me being proud so that they could be proud. And so I took it upon myself to be active in being visible in my identity. I'm not shying away from telling people who I am. But with visibility and publicity comes more shame from others. And so this is a period where I was being very open in sharing my story with young people, with the public. But I was still experiencing a lack of acceptance and discrimination from my own parents. And so I was really struggling with these feelings of shame that I still felt I was carrying inside of me. And I reached out to my sister. I love my sister, Juniper. And I let her know, I said, Juniper, I know this is the work that I want to be doing. I know that I want Indigenous, queer, and trans and non-binary young people to know that they have a place in this world. But I am also still struggling with the shame of not being accepted by the ones who I thought loved me unconditionally. And so I expressed this to her. And then not too long later, she came back to me and she said, Tanshai, I had a dream. I had a dream about you. And I said, well, tell me this dream. What was this dream? And so she told me her dream. And so back home in the North, in Dene country, We call it Denende. Denende means land of the Dene people. The Dene people belonged in the boreal forest in the subarctic of northern part of what is now currently known as Canada. And in this dream, Juniper said that it was almost as if she had an eagle aerial view of all of Denende, like she was looking down on the land of the Dene people. For miles and miles and miles, it stretched out in front and you could see it. And every part of Denende, as far as the eye can see, was full of Dene ancestors, of aunties and uncles and grandmas and grandpas. And in this dream, this hundreds of Dene ancestors spread across Denende. And every single one of them had a little pride flag. And they were all waving their pride flags in the air, and they were hollering and cheering and shouting. They were celebrating. And she told me this dream, and I broke down. I cried so hard because that was the sign, if you will, that I needed. It was a remembrance that I needed. I knew in that moment that my ancestors were there celebrating me for who I am. They loved me unconditionally. They were proud of me and my journey. And I knew in hearing that dream that my purpose was right, that I needed to be visible and represent those young people who deserve to be seen. So a part of me understanding that shame that I carried for so long really began to make sense to me and kind of unravel when I dug deeper into my family's own history with residential schools. You see, I am an intergenerational residential school survivor, which means my grandmother grew up in residential school and my mother grew up in residential school. And it was when I began to really learn about this systemic process of colonization that it all began to make sense to me. You see, pre-colonization, the time where Indigenous people still existed in these traditional territories on their lands, understandings of gender and sexuality were complex, were fluid, were flexible, varied, and region specific. There are certain Indigenous nations who have up to 5 different recognized genders in addition to male and female. 5 recognized and acknowledged genders in their community. And that varies across nations. Gender diverse people had always existed in Indigenous communities and nations pre-colonization. Not only did they just exist, again, they were recognized with specific, nation-specific terms and terminology that denoted this idea of two-spiritness. Two-spirit is a contemporary term. It's a modern term. It's not a term that had always existed. Two-spirit was created in 1990 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, at a conference of Indigenous gay and lesbian folks. And as a part of this conference, they said, this acronym, LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, trans, intersex, asexual, plus a plethora of other identities, we don't necessarily resonate with these terms, with this acronym, because we have always existed in our communities. And so Two-Spirit was created as a term to acknowledge indigeneity and queerness as being one whole identity rather than two separate identities. And the term two-spirit is specific to any Indigenous person who chooses to identify as such. But typically, it does denote masculine and feminine energy, or masculine and feminine spirits, a bridging or a balance of those two. But again, pre-colonization, this term didn't exist. Nations had their own words and terms for what we currently call two-spirit, which is ultimately gender diverse people. And so not only were two gender and sexually diverse people acknowledged within community, they were highly regarded, they were honored. Indigenous communities didn't operate on a hierarchy, so to speak. It was a collectiveness. It was every single person belonged in the community. Every single person had a place, a purpose, gifts, and strengths. And everybody was needed to make that community stronger, unless you were causing harm, in which case there were mechanisms for that. But everyone had a place in the circle. Two-spirit people pre-colonization were healers and caretakers and educators and shamans and guides and translators. One of the beautiful roles of two-spirit folks pre-colonization was that they would take in or care for, adopt children who didn't have parents to care for them. They would be welcomed in or adopted, so to speak, which is so beautiful that those two-spirit folks would care for those children who didn't have parents or family. There also wasn't always this assignment of gender. You know, we hear about gender reveal parties all the time, that as soon as a baby is born, is it a boy or is it a girl? The thing is, gender roles existed in Indigenous communities pre-colonization. There were men's roles, there were women's roles. That was important. It was important for a community, for culture, for ceremony. Gender roles were important. The difference is that there weren't just men's and women's roles. There were options beyond that. Again, there were multiple genders. So you had specific roles and special roles who folks who didn't identify as male, who weren't male or female, but still had that place in community. There's this beautiful story. So Mani Chikababi, who's a two-spirit elder, had told me that there were accounts in some Indigenous nations pre-colonization, where at the time that a child became toddler age, so by the time that a child was able to crawl or walk on their own, in some communities, what they would do is the elders in the community would lay out a set of bundles. And the bundles would represent typical male roles, toys, items, think like bows, arrows. And then there would be a bundle for women's roles. So maybe it had sinew or sewing items or what have you. So the elders would lay out these bundles. And they would actually get the child to crawl or walk to the bundle that they so chose, that their spirit resonated with. And whatever bundle that the child selected was the role that the child would be raised in. And so gender wasn't something that was assigned. Gender was something that was rooted in and linked to someone's inherent spirit and role and purpose in community. And so children actually had autonomy to decide how they wanted to be raised within community, which again is just so beautiful. And so if pre-colonization, gender and sexuality was so complex and fluid and varied and nation-specific, then something happened. And something did happen, and that was colonization. Colonization was and is inherently gendered. Complex, fluid, and varied understandings of gender and sexuality did not fit the mission of predominantly Christian Western settler state. And so when settlers came here to begin to build the nation state and imagine Canada as a nation state, there was an agenda. And Indigenous people, or then Indians, were seen as uncivilized, as heathens, of animals of this land. And so the goal of colonization was to assimilate Indigenous people into this Western colonial nation state, to become more like the West and less Indigenous, less Indian. And a perfect example of how to sum up this process of assimilation is actually by Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, who said, "The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change." And so Canada was built on this idea of doing away with the Indigenous people, with the Indian, with the uncivilized. And you'll see here, in all respects, with the other inhabitants of the Dominion. In Christian Western settler worldview, there was a right and a wrong. There was a nuclear family with a man and a woman bound under church or state. And anything outside of that was wrong, again, uncivilized, not okay. And so fluid and varied and flexible understandings of gender and sexuality were a direct threat and barrier to this nation state that they wanted to build, ultimately in the name of patriarchy, of men, and i.e. white men at the top. And so through colonization, land, culture, and language became governed and policed through formal policy, through formal systems, through things like the Indian Act, the Northwest Mounted Police, and residential schools. These all had incredibly gendered components of assimilation. Gender fluidity was outlawed at the same time culture and ceremony was. So back then, it was illegal for Indigenous people to practice culture. It was illegal for Indigenous people to perform ceremonies in public or to wear cultural or ceremonial items. They could be thrown in jail or worse. And at the same time that ceremonies and culture became outlawed and illegal, it also became illegal to, for example, cross-dress, for men to dress in women's garb, for women to dress in men's garb. Clothing was used as a tool to civilize. Anything seen as feminine was a sign of weakness. We began to see strict rules around gender and sexuality, including modesty. What is and isn't okay for people to wear. And strict rules were governed by church, state, and society, again, through formal policies and systems. Residential schools. When my grandmother showed up in residential at the age of 6, the first thing that they did when kids went to residential school is they got haircuts and new clothes. And so the girls were dressed in their dresses and the boys got their pants, and the boys' hair was buzzed short and the girls' hair stayed a little bit long. And then they were separated and they couldn't interact with each other. And so you see, even from a child showing up in residential school, how binary these understandings of gender were. But again, pre-colonization, something like long hair on men wasn't seen as feminine in the same way it was. It was long hair in men was a sign of warriorship, of strength. Long hair in men was something to be proud of and wear with pride. So something like cutting off the braids or the long hair of an Indigenous boy or man, it's a removal and erasure of that identity. So strict rules around gender and sexuality began enforced. Marriage, unions between man and woman was only deemed appropriate under the context of church and state. Anything outside of that was wrong, immoral, illegal, a sin. Within this Western worldview, there is an incredible dichotomy between right and wrong. There is one right way and anything else is wrong. So to be Indigenous was to be wrong. To be queer was to be wrong. Something that someone should feel shame for, should feel shame about. I grew up not knowing what it meant to be Indian, except that it was something nobody wanted to be. With the loss of land, language, ceremonies, teachings, familial connection, and the enforcement of colonial Western norms and rules, Indigenous culture began to deteriorate. Two-spiritness was erased, hidden, and suppressed because it was dangerous to be Indigenous, let alone to be queer and Indigenous. Not to mention language as a tool to govern. Indigenous people couldn't speak their languages. In residential school, you couldn't speak your languages. And the thing is, Indigenous worldview is rooted in the land. And Indigenous language is rooted in Indigenous worldview. And so to remove Indigenous language, you're removing that connection, you're removing that whole worldview and that connection to land. And that also means that you're losing those terms and terminology and ceremonies and protocols specific to gender diverse people. And we think about who was recording Indigenous histories. Indigenous people are oral people. We recorded our histories orally. And so at the time that histories began to be recorded, who was recording those histories? It was not Indigenous people. And so recordings around gender and sexuality were recorded with that perspective or lens of that colonial Western worldview. After decades and generations of assimilation, Indigenous culture and language shifted, and there became new norms. There became a hierarchy of gender and race, erasure of identities, binaries, commodification, exotification, hypermasculinity, and fear, homo and transphobia. All of these things became normalized in Western society and internalized and normalized within Indigenous communities. The process of colonization was and is inherently gendered. And so if you look at this little cycle here, I call it the cycle of gendered colonization. And so gender and sexuality was enforced through policy and systems. And when you have something that's formally enforced through policy and systems, what happened is this led to taboo and stigma regarding gender and sexuality, which leads to shame and suppression around gender and sexuality. So there were rules, which led to stigmas and taboos, which meant that it was not okay to be gender or sexually diverse, which means that gender and sexually diverse people began to internalize and feel shame and suppression for their identity, which leads to violence and self-harm. Indigenous young people die by suicide at a rate 7 to 11 times higher than non-Indigenous young people. Queer young people die by suicide at a rate 14 times higher than their heterosexual peers. Therefore, queer Indigenous young people are the most vulnerable demographic when it comes to experiencing violence, addiction, self-harm, suicide, homelessness, etc. And then the wheel keeps turning. Policy, taboo, shame, violence, policy, and the cycle keeps going round and round and round. And this is what I saw and experienced growing up. This is why I grew up in communities and a world where I was made to feel shame for who I was, for my indigeneity, for my queerness. We have all been told stories of how to be, how to feel, how to act, how to be perceived. It doesn't matter who we are or how we identify. We have been socialized and told so many different things. And when you boil this down, that's gender policing. It's people telling you how you need to look, how you need to feel on the inside, how you need to present yourself, how you need to walk in this world, how you need to be seen. All of these things are socialized and determined for us. And in my case, that felt so true growing up. I remember, oh man, I like to talk. How did the time fly by? So if the intent of colonization was to remove Indigenous people from culture and land and familial connection, and ultimately our spirit, our sense of self, then the way that we break this cycle of gendered colonization is to reconnect with culture, land, language, and our spirit, our sense of self. I'm going to read a short poem. This poem is called Two Halves of One Whole. One. You told me that I needed to be Indigenous before queer. You told me to contact you when Dene was first in my life and that you were sick of this queer business. Two, I held my heart in my right hand and my spirit in my left. To me, they sang the same song. Their energy, one tendril holding my body close to itself. How could I value one over the other when both give me life? Three, I was never taught Dene Suthane, so I spoke colonially. I was taught binaries, stigma, so I acted hetero-colonially. Four, for every word I learned that my lips only dreamed of touching, a piece of trauma uproots. For every body I learned that my lips only dreamed of exploring, a piece of shame uproots. Five, I worked hard to reclaim self. I flew home to a time before you where I am free from tainted soil. Six, I am Dene, always. I am queer always. I am colonial resistance. I am whole love. I am Indigenous magic. I am two-spirit. Yeah, thank you so much. Too many things, too little. So much. So what is the opposite of, or the alternative to, that cycle of gendered colonization that we saw? Those big words like fear and transphobia and homophobia and stigma and taboo. How can we facilitate and foster spaces where two-spirit, queer and trans Indigenous young people can feel like they belong? We as humans are made up of a multitude of parts. In Indigenous worldview, we believe in holism, that everything is interconnected and interrelated. So as beings, we are made up of mind, body, heart, and spirit. And if we think of two-spirit, queer and trans Indigenous young people moving through this world, and also allies and all other folks, in order to facilitate or feed or nourish our mind, we need access to knowledge. We need access to resources. In terms of facilitating or nourishing that heart self, we as beings need love. We need to feel love and give love. We need to feel connection in our lives, and we need to feel a sense of hope. And when it comes to that body aspect, we need safety, we need agency, and we need access. All of these things are what we need to live and exist as humans in this world. But at the core, we are spirit. An Indigenous worldview, spirit is that part of us, that sense of self that makes us feel like we are who we are. Spirit is a little fire that is always burning inside of us. And so long as that fire is burning, we know who we are. We know what our purpose is. And as soon as that fire dies out, we begin to lose sense of self, to lose that hope. And so our spirit place is the place of identity, purpose, and belonging. And so we need body, mind, heart to exist and survive, but we also need spirit to not just survive, but thrive in our existence as beings in this world. We're at this incredible time right now of resurgence for two-spirit, Indigenous, queer, and trans young people who are emerging and standing up and saying, hey, we have always been here and we are still here. And we're seeing this resurgence of art and culture and identity and young people being proud of who they are and not being afraid to stand up and say, hey, I'm two-spirit and I deserve to be here. I deserve safety, agency, access, love, connection, hope, knowledge, resources, identity, purpose, and belonging. I deserve to feel good as who I am. In Dene worldview, everything has spirit, regardless of physical entity. We all have spirit. Everything around us has spirit. Plants, trees, animals, rocks, fire, all contain spirit. And in Dene worldview, there's a concept of relationality or interconnectedness. It means that you and I are connected, that I and this plant and this tree over here are connected, that we are connected to each other. We exist in relation to everyone and everything around us. Everything exists in perfect reciprocity and harmony. It's a give and take. And so if we think of this Dene worldview of spirit existing beyond physical entities, of reciprocity and interconnectedness and relationality, then we can decolonize our understanding of gender and sexuality. So you'll see here, I put the binary. The binary refers to that male-female binary. So if we think of gender in terms of the male-female binary, which is that Western worldview, which is rooted in physicality, it's rooted in genitalia, that assignment based on birth, that if you are born with a certain set of genitals, that equals your gender identity. And that gender identity equals your gender expression, how you present yourself to the world. But to decolonize gender, what if we looked to that Dene worldview? What if we shifted from binary to balance? If we are made of a multitude of parts, then our spirit isn't determined or dependent on physicality or physical entities. They exist in harmony and relation to each other. And so rather than looking at male and female as a physical entity, what if we looked at feminine as masculine as energies, as spirits? And in this sense, feminine and masculine are energies that exist on a holic spectrum. It isn't a dichotomy, it isn't linear, it is whole. And if we look at it this way, then your sex does not equal your gender identity, does not equal your gender expression. It means as Tanchai Redvers, I was assigned female at birth. I am non-binary. I exist outside of this male-female binary, but I still contain a multitude of feminine and masculine parts and selves. My sex does not equal my gender, does not equal my expression. No matter how I choose to present myself, whether it's combat boots and boxer briefs or high heels and lipstick, I am still me. I am still my authentic self. In terms of gender performance as advocacy and ceremony, burlesque and drag is gender-based performance that contains components or elements of makeup, dress, costume, collective entertainment, and movement. And I think I would like to read a short essay on exactly this to kind of summarize everything that I've shared here today. And I brought it here. I wasn't sure if I wanted to read it. But yeah, burlesque and drag actively subverts assumptions and norms surrounding gender and sexuality. It's body reclamation. Gender-based performance art is body reclamation. This piece is called Remembering, Reclaiming, Reconnecting. Part 1. As a child, I was lucky enough to be raised in the North, among the birch trees that sheltered our family cabin along the river, within the bushes of cranberries and raspberries that populated my mother's First Nation, and beside fires that roasted the wild game and fish my father would harvest. As a Dene and Métis young person, I was a child of the land. Even though I didn't recognize it at the time, I was taught the beauty of connection and the reciprocal power of my relationship with the physical world. Through picking wild mint and watching my dad clean trout, I learned to only take from the land what I needed to and return to it what I didn't. I learned that in giving love, offerings, and thanks to the land, I would receive love and offerings in return. The land and I held each other as I rolled up in blankets on cold winter nights in order to draw shapes in the stars, and sat quietly in the willows in order to listen to the sounds of beavers working or geese flying above. I had so much respect for the stories the land told and love it gave. The land is inherent to Dene culture. In fact, there is no culture without the land. When I think of my ancestors, I think of grandmothers sitting by lake's edge, weaving sinew through birch bark baskets with their tan hands as children splash, laughing out loud in the water, and aunties and uncles hang dry fish above the fire, enjoying each other's company. One uncle would make fun of the other uncle about how poorly he filleted the white fish. Auntie would be telling her niece about the good-looking trapper a camp over, and grandbaby would be sitting in grandma's lap as grandma's arms wrapped around to show her how to thread the sinew. Everyone was connected, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually connected to each other, grounded and rooted in the love and respect of the land. Land loves unconditionally, wholly, offering truth and awareness of one's own self and breeding reciprocal connection. I was lucky enough to be raised in the North and build connection to my ancestral land. However, there was a large thread of disconnection that as I grew older began to weave itself stronger and stronger into my life. Unlike my ancestors, who were wholly and unconditionally rooted in and connected to cultural being through language, traditional practices, ceremonies, and kinship structures, my family was not. My grandmother was raised in residential school. My mother attended residential school. Therefore, I am an intergenerational residential school survivor. As a result of this, I did not learn my language, and my spiritual understanding was often confused with Catholicism. In fact, time on the land growing up was solace, a safe haven away from the day-to-day reality of home life in town, which was often unstable, chaotic, and at times pretty scary. The reciprocal and unconditional love, respect, and connection I learned from the land was not always reflected in my family life. Instead, I was receiving, learning, and internalizing shame, trauma, and abuse. And because connection is reciprocal, these were the things that began to be reciprocated. Life away from the land was full of teachings that collided with the ones the land offered. And in moving to the city from my hometown, I no longer had the safe haven reminder of unconditional love, respect, and connection. I became almost utterly disconnected from the land and caught up in the whirlwind of colonial reality. Through bullying, relationships, family trauma, and alcohol, I became lost and jaded. I succumbed to colonial expectations of self-worth, appeasement, and success. And before I knew it, I wanted nothing more than to run away from the place that offered me so much. And that's what I did. In losing connection to the stories, teachings, and beauty of the land, I lost connection to myself and my body. I carried trauma in my blood, shame in my heart, and the abuse I had experienced on my back. I suffered severe self-esteem and self-worth issues. I reciprocated the unhealthy behaviors I had learned in various relationships, and I desperately searched and searched for validation in others, in what became a vicious cycle of giving myself to others in hopes I would find something in return. This body is a shell, empty, lost, broken. I can give you what you want if that's what it takes to feel whole. Part 2. It's better with a drum. The first time I attended a women's drum circle, the moment my stick hit the drum in unison with the others, I started to cry. In that one beat, I felt like I had come home. I was wandering aimlessly through the dark night only to stumble across a warm cabin on the river. I felt the skin of the animal stretched over a wooden rim and thought about how it had gifted itself so that others could beat, singing proud. I was told that the beat of the drum was the heartbeat of Mother Earth, beating in unison with my own heartbeat, as if we were one. I felt the connection to my homelands, even though I was thousands of kilometers away in the city. The first time I did a burlesque class, the moment the music started and we were motioned to touch our neck, hips, thighs, I felt uncomfortable and I felt joy. I felt uncomfortable joy. Everything in my head was telling me that it was wrong and that I should not be doing this, let alone enjoying this. Unlike the first time I had hit the drum and felt at home, the welcome of home when I touched my own body was less obvious, less welcoming, but nonetheless present. The trauma, shame, abuse, and ultimately disconnection I felt throughout my adolescence had implanted itself in my bones. Raised as a young Indigenous woman, I was trenched in a world that normalized my disconnection to self. The same world that displaced me from the land I had grown up on had enforced a belief that I was not worthy and that I was powerless. My growth into womanhood and then two-spirithood was intertwined with the toxic narratives that surrounded me. Indigenous women were dispensable and weak. They were stereotyped and wrongly sexualized, costumes to be worn on Halloween. They were addicts and unfit mothers who couldn't raise their own children. They were objects to be assaulted, constant nameless headlines. They were missing and murdered, never worthy of being found, nor their murderers brought to justice. They were always less than, ploys of the colonizer used to enforce paternalistic gendered roles. They were never beautiful or good enough to be on TV and magazines. They were victims. So to explore my sexuality and gender on my own terms, to feel my own skin, to feel beautiful and in control felt strange. As a result of religious and state-led colonization, the autonomy of our own bodies and being has been unwelcome. But over time, the experience of feeling and beating the skin of that drum became the same as enjoying the touch and expression of my own. It reconnected me to my homelands that are also being exploited, disrespected, and used. You see, colonization and residential schools stole the respect of Indigenous land, women, and two-spirit people while demonizing self and community, love, pleasure, and joy. As a two-spirit person, I am the land. In pursuing burlesque and drag as a performer, I am remembering my connection to self and thus the land. I am conjuring up the teachings of respect and reciprocity I once learned. I am relearning unconditional love for the wounds and imperfections that stretch their way across my body and identity, my home beyond my homeland. For me, reclaiming, remembering, and reconnecting to my body is just as cultural as reclaiming, remembering, and reconnecting with the land. It's ceremonial. Before traders and missionaries came to my homelands of Denende, the Dene had strong medicine powers. Their medicine gifts came from the land, the animals, plant life, natural elements. And with them, they survived, healed, and received songs and teachings. Strong medicine people would use their medicine to ward off and rid of bad medicine that threatened to harm, weaken, or kill them and their kin. I believe that burlesque and drag to be medicine power, a reclamation and remembrance of the power that once was. As Midnight Wolverine, a strong Dene two-spirit being, my medicine is to ward off and rid of the bad medicine that continues to silence, abuse, and murder Indigenous land women and two-spirit people. By actively taking the control of my own body back, I am recreating the narrative that Indigenous women and two-spirit folks are powerful. By practicing the same unconditional love, respect, and reciprocity as I do with the land, with myself, I am restoring these traditional and cultural values. In celebrating myself in front of others, I am resisting and challenging the theft of pleasure and joy. I am bringing community together, reinstilling the collective belief that Indigenous women, two-spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous people are beautiful and worthy beings to be loved, respected, and celebrated. My hand caresses skin, worked and stretched, making sounds, connection with her, earth. She is beauty, power, love, resistance to all that doubt her, attempt to destroy her. I will never be made to feel shame for her again. She offers me so much. In summary, I just want to share that decolonizing concepts of gender and sexuality means looking beyond singular culture. Diversity has always existed in many forms. Rebuilding connection and relationship to our bodies requires understanding of the ways in which we have been disconnected and withheld, so that we can overcome that in the name of self-love and bodily freedom. We deserve to exist as we so choose and walk this world as our authentic selves. Decolonizing gender and sexuality also means giving space to those who have been historically and systemically affected by gendered colonization, specifically bodies of color. Existing as your authentic self in whatever shapes or forms that takes is radical performance art. So Masi Cho, thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for being a part of this change of breaking these cycles of gendered colonization. And Masi Cho, thank you for wanting to be a part of creating spaces so that Indigenous, queer, trans, two-spirit, and young people can access the purpose, belonging, love, connection, hope, safety, and access that we deserve. So Masi Cho, thank you.
Well, thanks so much to you, Tanchai, for sharing your truth, all of that incredible knowledge, and for offering a broader way of being in the world, us to think about that. So thank you, and we appreciate you coming all the way to Algonquin College to share that. And thank you to everybody online who took the time to join us today. Have a great afternoon. Wait, before I do that, actually, Ron wants to say something.
So this is the last time that I'll be holding a microphone at Algonquin College for quite a long time. I wanted to offer my apologies for not being able to be a proper host to you today. I'm personally facing some immigration issues. My work permit to be in Canada expires today, which means that I have to return to the United States by midnight tonight, or be forced into a colonial process whereby I become a landed immigrant in our own traditional territory. So I've been dealing with some stuff today that has not allowed me to welcome you as I intended, to learn from you as I intended. And I am really honored and glad, and as sad as I am in many parts of my spirit and my mind, I am proud of the spaces, the team, the work, and the kinds of activities that we have enabled to take place here at the college. So I just wanted to say thank you as an individual. My apologies for not being able to learn from you. I consider myself queer, and I've often been asked if I was two-spirit, and I don't know that we have that concept anymore as a Haudenosaunee. I would assume at one point, well, I know at one point there was something. I don't know if that was the words we would have used, but I was really looking forward to learning. And so I regret not being able to do that. But I do not regret the commitment and the relationships and the good work that many people here at the college do. And much of the true and authentic commitment a number of people are making to truth, reconciliation, and decolonization, and whatever the term indigenization means. And so I look forward to watching this work continue from afar, hopefully return eventually. But moreover, just to thank you for what you do on your journey, and the education and the spirit and the good mind that you bring to the work that you do. You're well known for it, and I am at an extreme disadvantage to not have been able to be by your side today, and I wanted to acknowledge that. So welcome to the territory. I myself am not Algonquin, so I can't say to our territory, but welcome to Algonquin College, and I hope that you've had a good time while you were here. Thank you. I don't know if you wanted to do a different closing.
I didn't hear you.